Alright, so today we're going to look at some basics for Jest testing and using snapshot testing. So snapshot testing is pretty easy to do and it gives you some coverage, but I'll talk about sort of the limitations of it. So Jest is automatically available and usable if you use Create React App. So it's already there and set up and configured for you to use. So Jest is developed by the same people who develop React. So that's another reason that it's a good thing to use when you have a React application, because it's more likely that it's going to work well without problems. So it's built on Jasmine and Mocha by React developers, automatically used with Create React App. It provides mocking and snapshots. We won't talk about mocking today because it's sort of a big topic, and I don't think we'll have time, and I need to honestly finish getting my head around it because there's so much that you can do with mocking. But we'll talk about snapshots, and we'll talk about just sort of like unit testing with Jest. It does have a rich assert library. It uses, you use expect with it, and there's a bunch of add-ons that you can use to get more assertions and things like that, and it has a command line interface. It works really well with React, but you can use it with other types of applications. Any JavaScript, you can use Jest to test it. So when you use Create React App, you get the test script defined in your package JSON. You'll notice that it's there. So it'll say test, React scripts, test, env equals JS DOM. So JS DOM is sort of allows you to do testing without having to use a browser. So it provides, it hosts the DOM instead of having to host it in a browser. And since that uses Jest, you can just run npm test in your client, and it'll run all the tests that are recognized by Jest. So what tests are recognized? How is a file recognized as a test by Jest? Well, one way is if it's in a special subdirectory with a double underbar test double underbar anywhere in your project. It'll find any file in there. It doesn't matter what it's named. And any file that has a name that ends with .spec, .spec.js, or .test.js, and those can be in any directory. So anything that meets those descriptions will get run. Jest will attempt to run it when you're on npm test. Now you might have noticed that when you run Create React App, it actually creates a default test for your app. And that test just makes sure that it renders without crashing, basically. So we'll have a look at that in a minute. So there's some cool features that that come with Jest. There's test coverage, so you can see what your test coverage is. There's a watch mode, which is pretty cool, and that's what it runs in by default with Create React apps, with React scripts running it. You can use regular expressions to match to run a subset of tests, like test with a certain name or test for a certain component. And you can use snapshots and mocking. So test coverage, you just run with the coverage flag. Now since the way that test is described under scripts in the package JSON, you have to pass this -- space and then any arguments you want it to pass in. So that's the only way it consumes the arguments that you pass on the command line when you run npm test. So you'll run npm test -- space -- coverage. So let's have a look at that now. Let's look together and see what kind of coverage we have right now. So if you go into your client directory, so like that, npm test -- space -- coverage. And we have a problem. So we can see that there's one test defined and it failed. So let's see why it failed. This is our one app test, and it fails because it says local storage isn't defined. So you'll remember that in our app we're using local storage. We're saving things to local storage, and that's a property of window, which is associated with the browser. So this isn't available because we're using JS DOM and we're not using a browser. So what we have to do to get around this is we have to define local storage for the purpose of testing. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our client. Let's make sure I'm in the right place. Okay. And we're going to create a new file in source called local storage. It does. That's right. So we're going to create local storage.
Well, because it gives you like an HTML document that you can look at.
It does. Yes, it sure does. So in local storage, we're just going to make it. We're going to basically, anytime we're writing stuff for tests to be able to run, we do the minimum possible to get the test to run. So we're just going to export default, new class, and we'll define a store. And we'll define a set item. That, well, we can make it even simpler than that. We can just say this dot store dot key, sorry, equals value, and we'll define a get item. And we'll define a remove item. Oops, sorry, I need a curly boy there. Ah! No, don't need commas. VI just bit me. And define a clear function. I can do it with parentheses. And then we'll call it. Okay.
So you're pretty much just creating like all the local storage methods that we use.
That's right. That's right. So we're just defining a local storage, defining methods on the local storage, so that when we use it from our app.
It's not going to be like, yo, what's going on?
Yep. Yep. So we have to do one more thing after defining it.
We only want this running during tests, right?
That's right. That's right. So I'm going to show you how we'll get it to only be used. So when we're just running our app, it's going to use window.localStorage because we haven't imported this. You know, we're not using this one in our app code. So we have to use it from our test. So if we take a look at our app.test.js. Here, hold on. I'll make sure that that code is right. We'll test it in a minute, and then I'll paste it into Slack, so in case you don't have it. Okay, so what we'll have to do here is we'll have to import local storage from local storage. This is our test. And then we're also going to say when okay. And then we're going to say window.local storage equals local storage. So that should set us up in this file, in app.test, to use this local storage that we just defined. So let's see if I typed all of that in the right way. I'm just going to try npm test. I didn't. What did I do? Oh, did I not save this file yet? Hold on. I'm the worst at that. Okay, now it passes. I spent hours one day trying to figure out why something wasn't working. I was like, it's so obvious that that should work. And I was like, oh, I didn't save the file.
Does Adam give you like a little, the VS Code gives you like a little silver
I think
white dot?
it gives you, yes, something, but it's like my eyesight's not good enough to notice that. I need something like big. It needs to like glow or something when it's not saved yet. Okay, so does anybody need me to put the local storage stuff in Slack?
Window.local storage equals local storage. And the app.test.js.
Yeah, so in app test.js, we just have those two lines. So we're just importing local storage from the file we just defined, and then setting window.local storage to use that. And that's in app.test.js. So this is all we have to do to get our built-in app test to work. And we only have to do this again because our app is using local storage, right? If our app weren't using local storage, we wouldn't have this problem. So what you'll notice is that if you just run npm test on its own, then it runs all tests, typically except in some circumstances that I'll mention a little bit later, and it runs it in what's called watch mode. So you'll see that I'm still in session here, so it didn't return me back to the terminal. It's still running, and you can see that there's some options here. So it shows us the test that passed. It gives us whatever we put in the describes or the its, to show us what it's running. And it tells us if it's passed or not. It tells us how long it took to run. And we can run it again by typing A to run all tests. It'll run it again. But if we make any change to any file that touches this test, it'll run again automatically, even if we just save, actually. So if I go here to my test file and I save, it runs it again. If I go to app.js and I save, it runs it again. Okay, so it's a common practice when you're developing something to just keep it running in watch mode. It'll be up to you. It might be really annoying. But sometimes we get into a mode where we're like making lots of changes to files. And if you have this running in the background, you might catch some things that you've, done wrong that you didn't notice. It might save you from some kind of painful debugging later if you've made like 10 changes and now your app doesn't work anymore. Now this test, just because the test passed doesn't mean your app's going to work, right? But if the tests don't pass, your app probably won't work unless there's a problem with the test. So if we run with coverage now, so you just queue to quit out of there. So we will be able to run with coverage now without it failing. I'm going to make this window a little bit wider. And so it did npm test -- space -- coverage. So if you're using Jest directly on the command line, which I'm not, and I'll tell you why in a second, if you were using Jest directly, you would just say Jest space dash dash coverage. Okay, so the argument is dash dash coverage. But because of the way that the scripts are interpreted, what's written here in the package JSON, it won't accept any arguments or read any arguments, interpret any arguments unless you add that dash dash after test.
Is that like a CLI thing, or is that like a...
I think it's the way that that the package JSON file, what's defined there, gets interpreted.
So if you change it there, then you can change how
You can. So if you wanted, for example, for it to always show coverage, then you could add a dash dash coverage in here.
We can make your own script and call it test coverage.
You could. That's right. That's right. So you could do that.
But you always need the dash dash. You know?
Not if you define it in here.
Yeah, you can change it in there.
Yes, that's right. So if you change it in there, you would just use this dash dash coverage. You wouldn't need the dash dash space dash dash. We have to use the dash dash space because we're just using what's defined for npm test, for the test script. So we can see here that, you know, our app doesn't have a whole lot of coverage, but it's got some. And because our app uses other bits and pieces, and because our test uses local storage, we can see that there's partial coverage there. And you can see over on the right, it'll tell you, this is really handy, which lines in your code are not covered by testing. So that's pretty handy. So what we'll do now is we'll add some more tests. But first, I just want to point out some things about app test. So you can see it uses it. Jest uses the same globals describe and it to define tests and recognizes those. So we could put a describe around this if we wanted to. And we could put our it inside of it.
Do that. Yeah.
I'm using VI.
Yeah, sure. That's. Oh, really?
So I have a Vim plugin in my Atom, so I can use VI in it because I so naturally do that when I'm using a text editor that it still causes problems because it doesn't behave exactly the way that VI does in Terminal. So it annoys me a little bit.
That is a.
Without using your VI.
Yeah, so I just did a 5 DD to delete 5 lines, so I can keep my hand on the keyboard direct, you know, just right on the letter keys, which makes it faster for me. So I used L, I used Control L, I did.
And then you can just use Command Control and just the up arrow.
Right, cool.
But that one's quicker.
So the other cool thing about VI is that you have multiple copy buffers. So I can copy like 2 lines into buffer A and 2 lines into buffer B.
Yeah, that's cool, man.
And then I can paste from buffer A and paste from buffer B. And you can do it across files as long as you're in the same session. And then I can say 4DD to delete. Oops, I should have been up
So
one
you
line.
delete 4 lines with that.
Yeah.
Right.
You can do things like FD to go to the next D. You can do things like change forward T or D forward, change forward T, and then type something else there. And then once you do something, like if I wanted to change React to all caps, I wouldn't do that, of course, but I could do change forward T, React, and then I can use the dot. Except that didn't work the way I wanted to because I think I messed up. Yes, anyway, VI.
What's that called?
VI or Vim.
Just use Vim, man.
All right, so I digressed a little bit, but I like VI, it's fun. Okay, so let's talk about snapshots for a minute, because snapshots are one way to increase your test coverage, but it's got a very special purpose use, and it has some limitations. So I'm just going to go back to the slides for a minute, and we'll chat about a couple of things. This is just so I remember to talk about the things that I want to talk about. Okay, so we talked about watching tests. One thing, so you know how when you run npm test, it puts it in watch mode. And if you don't want it to put it in watch mode, now it puts it in watch mode, you can just type Q and it exits. But if you don't want it to run in watch mode, possibly because you're using continuous integration and your continuous integration is using what's defined in scripts, I don't know how many times that actually happens, but you can override that behavior anyway by putting this CI equals true. This is an environment variable, stands for continuous integration, equals true in front of this React scripts test env.js DOM, and it won't run it in watch mode. It'll just run it once. That's right. That's right. So that's why the environment variable is called that, and that's why it has that result. So it'll just run it once, and it won't run it in watch mode if you add that. Okay, snapshots. If you want to use snapshots, first of all, it requires renderer from React Test Renderer, so that's something we'll have to install. Snapshots are really sensitive, so it's good for regression testing. If one little change happens to the way your component renders, basically this tests the way your component renders, and it makes sure that it renders the way you expect it to. So you run it the first time, and it creates a snapshot of the way that your component renders. And then when you run it any time after that, it compares what gets rendered against that snapshot. So if anything changes, then this test is going to fail. So you can see for that reason, it's not super useful when you're just starting to develop a component. So it's not really for test-driven development at all. That's not what it's good for. And it's also not good for components that are likely to change a lot, or large components. It's really meant for components that just provide something to display, components that are just providing content that gets displayed. So we have a couple of components like that we can demonstrate this on. But if your component fits into that category, snapshots are super easy to use. It's really easy to add a snapshot test, and it's really quick. So we'll have a look at how we do snapshots. So we could add a snapshot for our bookmark component, because basically it just renders a bookmark. So that's a good candidate for a snapshot test. So I'm just going to create a bookmark test file. You could create a test subdirectory if you wanted to, and how you do that is really up to you. But I'm just going to create a bookmark.test.js. And
so Janelle, that won't care about what's actually passed to the bookmark component, because obviously the details will be different each time.
That's right. That's right. It will actually. What happened here? Am I in the wrong place? Yeah. Okay. What is going on? I have two open is the problem. I need to close the other one. I don't know what happened. Hang on a second. I don't know what just happened. So let me do a, let me make sure I'm in the right place. Give me just a minute to figure out what I have done. Why does this have content? Okay. All right. I don't know how that file got populated, but I was doing a lot of stuff, so. All right, so we're going to have to import React because we're going to use some, we're going to refer to our component. And we also have to import our component because that's what we're going to test. And we're going to have to import renderer from React test renderer. Is that right? React test renderer. Yeah. Then we'll describe our test. I'm just going to say bookmark at the describe level. And then we'll define a test. Oh, stop. We'll say should render as expected. So what we're going to do first is we're going to use renderer to create basically the root of our DOM that we're going to test against. So we're going to say const tree equals renderer create, and what we want to create, we want it to call our bookmark component. So we're going to do that. Now if we look at our bookmark component and see what it expects, it expects an ID, title, URL. It has this remove in it right now, but we aren't even actually using it. So we don't need to pass that in, but we'll pass in ID, title, and URL. And then it also has a button. Well, we could pass in, it is referring to remove, sorry. It uses remove as a function in this case, so we'll have to pass that in as well. So this is how we'll do that. So we'll say ID equals just whatever. Title equals, we'll just say my bookmark. URL equals HTTP mybookmark.com. And we'll say remove equals, and we'll just define an anonymous function. Yeah, and that should, oops, sorry. That should be okay. So basically we're just creating some fake content, however we want to create it. And what we want to make sure is that we it renders the way we expect it to, so we're passing in arguments that make sense for our bookmark component. So when we pass in arguments like this from our application, then we expect it to render a certain way. And you don't have to create the snapshot. You don't have to figure out what it's supposed to look like and then define that. It'll do it for you if you just say that you expect the tree, and we have to do to JSON on the tree because that's what to match snapshot will compare against. And it's just like that. So then we say we expect the tree that gets rendered to match the snapshot that gets generated. Okay, so I'm going to save this and let's see if I have any typos. So if I do npm test.
So this is comparing that tree that we just created to the bookmark component. The bookmark component.
Yeah, so it's going to call the bookmark component.
Yep.
And it's going to pass in those arguments, and then the bookmark component is going to return what it renders.
Yep. And then what's it matching to? The bookmark.
So what it's matching to is the snapshot that it creates the first time. I don't know why I have two snapshots. I've got a polluted environment here, which is really annoying. Let me figure out where my other snapshot is. Oh, where did this come from? Hold on. Okay, so you may have noticed, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to delete this snapshot, and I'm going to run the test again. I may have already recreated it. Okay, so the first time you run your test, after you define this test with toMatch snapshot, it'll create the snapshot. So you'll see it says one snapshot written in one test suite. And we can go look at that snapshot. So if we go here and we look at the snapshot, you can see what it renders. So it renders just like if you look at our bookmark, you can see what it should render, and that's reflected in our snapshot. So we have the title, we have the URL with target blank, with visit, the word visit for that link, and then we have a button with on click equals some function that we just passed in an anonymous function, and the word delete with an exclamation point, and that's what gets rendered by a bookmark component. And that looks right to us. That's what we expect it to look like. Now, every time we run the test again, now from this point on it compares what it gets when it runs that test to the snapshot that's stored. So now if we make any change to bookmark, like say we remove the exclamation point from delete, and we save, and the test runs again, and it fails. And it says, this is what's in the snapshot, and this is what we received. It doesn't match anymore, so that test failed. Now, when a test fails, you have a choice of either updating the snapshot, because sometimes you might want the change, right? And sometimes you don't want the change. So in this case, if we actually want the change, we don't want the exclamation point there anymore, so we want to update the snapshot. Then what you do is you run npm test, the dash dash, so we can pass an argument. And we're going to pass a dash u. So a dash u tells Jest, if any snapshots fail, I want you to update the snapshot. Okay, so when I run this, it's going to say, one snapshot was updated, and now they passed. So now if we go look at our snapshot again, we'll see that the exclamation point was removed from delete. Now, likewise, if we made any change to the snapshot by hand, then the test would fail, of course. So you can see it's just doing like It's very sensitive. It just does a direct comparison of the snapshot that's saved to what gets rendered. So if anything changes in the snapshot or anything changes in the file to change the way it's rendered, then the test is going to fail, and you either have to update the snapshot or fix what is causing it to render differently. So we can add a snapshot test like this for sign-on, for sign-in, because it also just renders a form. So we would pass in handle sign-in, which is a function, so just an anonymous function. Login error is some, error message, right? So you can imagine that to define a test for sign-on, it's as simple as saying, oh, geez, what are you doing to me? Just define a signin.test.js. And again, we'll import React because we're going to use refer to our sign-in component. We're going to use some JSX. Import sign-in from sign-in, and import renderer from React test renderer. Now, I already had renderer installed. You must have too. It must have been in the package.json. So if you didn't have it in the package.json when you did your install, of course, the test would fail and say, I don't know where renderer is. It's not defined, and you'd have to install it. So again, we just describe. Sign in. It should render as expected. And so we define the tree, renderer, create, and then we're going to do sign in. And sign in needs handle sign in, which is a function, so we'll just give it an anonymous function. And is that all I need for that? Oh, I need to put it in curly braces. Yeah, it didn't feel right. And then we need login error, and we can just set it to anything, or it could be blank. And then after this, do you remember what we need to do? So we're going to have sign in render according to these inputs, and then we just want to say that we expect tree to JSON to match snapshot. That's it. Super easy, right? Nothing to it. So if we have this guy over here, you can see it's been running. I should have stopped it, but that's all right. And it says, oh, okay, if we try to run it again, what's the problem? What did I do wrong? What is it complaining about? Sign in test failed to run. Test suite must contain at least one test. What am I missing, guys? It does contain. Oh, I need to save. Again! Dang it! All right. So you can see that a snapshot was written because we just saved. We just ran a test that called to match snapshot. So if we look at this snapshot, we can see that it renders a form. That's what we expect. On submit, it runs a function, and then it prints an error if there's an error. And then it's got the attributes of the sign-in form. And all that's the way that we expect it to be. And so now every time we run this test, it'll pass unless we change the way the sign-in form renders. So that's all pretty straightforward, isn't it? There's not much to that. So we can have a look at our test coverage now. So it's a little bit better. We can see that line 8 isn't fully covered in bookmark.js, and that's because line 8, we're not actually testing that this function gets called. So that's a mocking scenario. We won't talk about it today. All right. So that's not going to be covered until we can do something to test that this function gets called.
Mocking's like going in and like clicking on elements and interacting with them.
It means a couple of different things, but yeah, mocking basically is providing like a copy of a function that behaves like the function that you actually want to test without being the function you want to test. So it does sort of the minimum that that function would do. So it doesn't actually test that function. To test the remove function, we would have to write a unit test that tests the remove function. Okay? But to test that, what we're missing here is we're testing that we're calling that function. Because we're just passing in an anonymous function. So in order to test that we're calling that function correctly, then we would have to have a mock function that we can call and spy on to see that it gets called. Okay? Yeah, so to actually test the remove function would be a unit test on remove. So let's talk about unit testing a little bit. We'll do it with the local storage we just added. So you can see local storage, we could easily get that up to 100% with some pretty simple unit tests. So I just want to show you that creating unit tests in Jest is just as easy as creating unit tests, you know, that we've done already where we used a Mocha or Chai or whatever to run those. So if we go to local storage and we create a local storage test, so we'll just do new file, local storage test.js, and here we're going to import local storage. I think that might be all we need. I'll figure it out. Because we're not going to use a snapshot or anything. We're not rendering anything here. We're just testing that functions work the way we expect them to. So let's do a describe local storage. And let's do
We're just going to use a cert now?
we're not going to use assert, we're going to use expect. Should be able to set and get items. Let's just that. So we're going to have to set some stuff up. We'll say const key equals key and const value equals value. And then we'll do, we'll say local storage dot set item key value, and we'll say const return value equals local storage dot get item key, and then we'll say expect return value to equal value. Now, when I look at this, I think we should probably, in order to keep our environment, our testing environment unpolluted, we could do an after each. So we can use after each, after all, before each, before all, just like we can. Otherwise, we could say local storage dot clear.
Do we have a clear?
I believe we do. Let's make sure. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if I have any typos. So let's start this running again, npm test, because I really like how it just updates when you save. So let's save. It fails. So it fails because return value is not defined. Oh,
That's just empty.
so it would help if I use the same variable name. Okay, so that test passed. And let me show you a couple of other things with Watch while we're here. So you can see it says press W to show more options. So we can say, for example, that if you want to filter by a file name, you can type P, and then you can say, like, and see right away it shows you what's going to run with that filter. So if I started to type local storage, no, it's just going to run that test. That's pretty cool, right? You can also filter on test names. So I could say render. I thought that should render. Didn't I say render as expected? It's because I think we're already, hold on.
Oh, you're already in the
I think we are, yeah. Okay, let's do this and do A for all. So we have to go back to all. So yeah, so it actually nests those filters. So now if I say T for test, and I say,
how are you getting into pattern mode?
so I'll show you. So here, I'm going to go back to all. So here I'm in all. I typed A to run all tests. So P to filter by a file name regex pattern. T to filter by a test name regex pattern. So that's what's in your describe and your test, descriptors. O to only run tests related to changed files. So if you don't want it to run every test, every time you make changes, and you only want it to run tests on files that changed, then you would use O. So if I say T, then I can say render. So that's going to run my renders without crashing from app, and my should render as expected for my 2 snapshot tests. So I click, and it just runs those, and you can see that it skips 2 tests because 2 tests don't meet that pattern. So we'll go back to running all. So let's look at our coverage now for local storage. Now we aren't testing everything yet, but we can see which lines aren't being tested. So we can see half of it's tested now, but lines 5 and 6 aren't tested. So we can go look at local storage and see that's clear. So even though we're calling clear and after each, that doesn't count as a test because we're not asserting that we're not running any expect against it to see that it actually did what it was supposed to do, and we're not testing remove yet. So if we go back, we can easily add those. So we can add a it should remove an item. And we can I think this is one. Now the expect, I put this link in the modules. Here's all the things that are available to you with expect. So there's a lot of different assertions that you can do there. So let's get my terminal.
Clear first?
Huh?
Did we use clear?
Not yet. We'll add it. I'm just going to get this right. I just want to make sure I don't have typos. Okay. I'm going to save this. Runs again and it failed because I did something wrong. Oh, God, I do this all the time. Okay, so that's okay now. Now we'll say should clear all items. My hand keeps hitting. I need to disable this stupid mouse pad thing. That's what keeps happening. It's really annoying. One, two, three. So now if we check coverage, you can see local storage is 100% covered now. So, yeah, that's...
Just go back to code.
Yes.
So there we, the last one, you're still testing return value, but you probably want to test the entire local storage thing.
Yeah, so we should maybe say we could add. We could do. What do we have available in here? Because we only have. Oh, we could. Dot store. Can we refer to dot store directly?
You just want to check that local storage is empty.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to think of how we do that.
Like a wildcard to get it.
Or just local storage.
I don't know that that'll work.
Local storage, right? If there's anything
Possibly, but I think it still might be defined. We just have to test that it's empty. You know what I mean? So we could add another function. I mean, another function to local storage.
Maybe and just make sure there's nothing in there. Type local storage, see what comes up. It's either going to be null.
Yeah, but you want to automate. You want to automate your. Yeah, so you mean to figure out what to assert on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe local storage dot length. Or do you?
Let's see if it
it's
works.
easy when you run it, isn't it?
Let's try that. Let's try.
Well, if it's working.
To.
Can you get a dot length on a?
I don't know.
object?
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. We're gonna say. Oh, I have to run over here. Received undefined. What if we do? I don't know if this will work either. Nope. Doesn't like that either. It's gonna say. So we could do this.
So it's local storage dot storage dot length.
Dot store dot length.
Dot storage with a capital as well.
Is it?
Yeah, so
Why is-
inside local storage when it's empty, you've got an object called storage.
But remember, we're using our mocked local storage, and it's got a store. But I tried that, and it didn't like that, unless length is a property, right, and not a function. Pretty sure it's a property.
So property.
But if we did, if we added something here, I don't know if this will work. Let's just see if. What assertions do we have? Yeah, to be truthy. Let's see. It's not a function. Oh wait, I bet I didn't save it. Hold on.
And so we're setting this dot store to an empty object when we care, right?
Yeah, so we need to set.
So there's no length in there then. There's no length property.
Well, it's a store is it's not length. No, you're right. It's what is it? What would we check? If it's empty.
It's an empty
Dot
object.
keys. Hmm?
Is an empty object false?
Yeah, you check on.
Well, is empty, I'm checking that length equals 0 and is empty, so that should return true, but this isn't working. So I need to test, I need to check something else, not dot length. Maybe this dot store dot properties of objects.
I've just done rep val equals local storage dot store, and then expect rep val to equal empty object.
Yeah.
Okay. To equal, and then you did just like oh, sorry, like that. Nice. Nice.
The other way that touches
Yes.
to set it equal to rate val. You just use the logical storage to store it in
You could, so you could say, and that's fine too.
So to equal, I think teachers will use
Yes, an empty object.
Yeah, that's
We're not the browser, it's where we sit.
All right. So, any questions about any of that stuff? It's all pretty clear. It's not too hard, right? It does start to get complicated when like testing, having full testing for something like app would be complicated. Even mocking gets a little bit tricky. That's why I'm going to talk about it another time, so I don't kind of muddle things today, and because I think it would take more time than we want to take today. And I want to kind of focus on the things that I think will be most useful, and I need to honestly do a little bit more research before I can tell you what that is, because there's so many different ways to mock. There's so many different kinds of libraries and methods to do it, and some of them have dependencies on certain add-ons, and some of those add-ons are reliable, and some of them are less reliable. So I spent a lot of time this weekend trying to pick the ones that I think would be most useful to use without causing problems. But I really would like to do a little bit more research before I show you. So what I suggest you do for a challenge is to add some snapshot testing to your project. Maybe some unit testing, to test basic functions. And then when you want to show for your assessment that you've handled testing, then you could show your coverage report. You could point out where you're not fully covered, why you're not fully covered. Just being able to talk about that, the sort of the complexities of testing. What you'll find, and Matt's going to talk tomorrow about some structuring of your application, some patterns and best practices. And when you'll find that not only can using nice patterns and nice structure make your code more reusable and easier to maintain, but it also makes it more testable. If your code's not sort of nicely organized with, sort of display separate from manipulating state and data, keeping those things separate, then it becomes really complicated to test. So if you separate those things out into separate modules and separate components, then it's much more straightforward to test your application. And of course, that means it's also more straightforward to maintain it, to understand it, to work on it with other people, that sort of thing. So after Matt talks tomorrow, then you might have some takeaways for your project too. But I think you could at least write some snapshot tests to get some test coverage, and that'll be something you can talk about in your assessment and how it's useful. Also talk about the limitations of it, just to show that you have an understanding of that. All right, cool. Thanks, guys.
Can we grab